Hi, and welcome to another episode of Learning with Power. And I'm Scott Powers Houston, and this is episode number 29 for those of you who are keeping count. And this episode is going to be called The Historicity of Jesus. All right, so let's get to it. Okay, so basically what got me onto this to begin with was a friend of mine invited me to they wanted me because I was playing softball for their team and I was a center fielder, and basically I was playing pretty well, and so that people in the league didn't complain. This was in California, this was Anaheim, that I was a ringer, which was comical, but I had to be at least a member or somebody, a parishioner, right, of their church that was sponsoring our team. And so the first introduction that he made was he invited me to this big, let's call it come to Jesus meeting, okay? It was a Calvary church, and it was in East County. This building was massive, huge building, and the parking lot, must have had 100,000 cars. It was like it was like you were going to an Angels game. It was like you're going to a stadium, and you filed into this place. And you looked around, or let's say like a Lakers game, and you look around, and it's just people everywhere. There had to be like 30,000 people in the place. It was massive. And so the guest speaker comes up there, and he's apparently a Bible historian, and he's a highly credited, well-known, got doctorate degree, from a Bible college, and he does these lectures all over the country, I guess, and this is how he makes his living, a good living too at that, right? And so he's going on about the historicity of Jesus, actually. He's starting to talk about the historicity of Jesus. And he says, without even flinching an eye, he says, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence to prove that Jesus was a real person. There's a mountain of evidence, and nobody dares to, or it didn't say that. He says no historian, even any academic historian, acknowledges that it's true. And there's literally no historians that are accredited who say that Jesus didn't exist. So we know that he existed, and I'm looking all around, and he says there's a mountain of evidence. So I'm looking all around, and everybody's just going. And everybody's nodding their head. There isn't a single dissenter out of 30,000 people in the entire house. Just everybody like lemmings. But me, I say to myself, wait a tick. Is that really true? If it's true, it's true, is there really a mountain of evidence? Is there really an overwhelming amount of evidence that Jesus was a real person? Is that really true? If it is, it is. I'll be the first to admit it. But I wanted to investigate it. So I wanted to maybe do a forensic type investigation. Like forensic files. Let's see. Of course, there's no DNA and things like that. But forensic. We can do sort of a forensic investigation, an forensic archaeological investigation to determine whether this was really a real person. And so I had an idea to do this. And I thought, well, maybe I could make a documentary or something like that. And I thought, what I would like to do maybe is to actually go to Israel and see if I can find records or, actual contemporary records or something, because what he said in this presentation that he was giving for all these 30,000 people was that there was there's a overwhelming amount, he said, there was an overwhelming amount of Roman records to verify that Jesus was a real person and he was crucified. And that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, including within the Roman archives or whatever, to prove that he was true. And I said, well, really? Because, I mean, I know a little bit about history, and I know how history goes. and I thought, well, so how do I find out if this is true? How do I do this investigation? And then in my research on the internet, I learned, so this was around 2016, I guess, that I decided to really investigate it. So when it actually happened, when I went to Calvary, okay, the first time it happened was around the year 2000. But in like 2016, I'm doing internet searching, and I'm like, how can I find how can I do this? Because I'm at that point I was like in the world of academia at that point. And so I wanted to say, well, let's see if I can use some of the contacts that I have and stuff and do some actual, dig in and do some actual research, because I had some access to like some like real archives and real files at that point. And so I was like, how do I do this? Well, as it turns out, by that time, there was already a guy called Richard Carrier who had already done it for me. And we're back. Okay, so this is the book that Richard Carrier wrote. Richard Carrier. And he wrote this in about 2014 on the historicity of Jesus. Now, he actually wrote 2 books on the same subject. The other one was written in like 11 or 12 or something. And basically, the story behind him writing this book, or these books, was by that time he was an already well-established academic. He had doctorate degrees from prestigious universities, and he'd already published several different historical theses and stuff. And he was very well respected, and people actually went to him and pitched him the idea and said, why don't you look into it? And basically he was, he like everybody else in the West, he grew up believing Jesus is a real person and hearing all the same narrative, that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence to prove that he was a real person. And so he naturally assumed that if he did research on this, that he would find all the evidence that there is that Jesus was a real person. And but let's find out. Is it really there or is it not? It's a valid question. You're allowed to question things, right? And so the first book that he writes, it was really an academic book that's kind of a tough read, and you have to be an academic to really chew through it. And basically he talks about using Byam's theorem and things like that, which is basically like a theorem in philosophy and statistics to prove the probability or the probable odds or the probable outcomes of an event being true or not being true. He's applying Byam's theorem is what he decided to do. And so the first book is all about how he's going through all the processes of doing all the analysis, all the intricate analysis, and then plugging it into the theorem basically, and then coming up with a hard number theorem, like this is 90% true, or this is only 15% true, or things like that. And so he plugs it all in. And so it's kind of a tough read. But then this is the second book. And it basically is the results from the first book. So from all the research and all the analysis that he talks about in the first book, basically the results are what he talks about here. And so this is the book really to read if you're a layman. If you're an academic and you're trying to mount an academic argument against what he said, you're going to need to read the first book too, because in the first book is how he analyzes and shows his process and his thinking process for how he came out with this analytical analysis, let's just say. Allow myself to introduce myself. Anyway, Austin Powers. But anyway, okay, yeah, so he did this analysis. All right, so now, for me to get this book from the library, I bought this book, this is mine, but originally I got it from the library. And I went to the library, and this is a big library in Knoxville, and of course the University of Tennessee is right there, and none of the branches in Knoxville nor at the University of Tennessee and their very large extensive library had the book. Nobody. So I had to do what was called an inter-office loan. And they found the book in a couple of weeks at a place, at a university actually, in Alabama. And they sent it up to Knoxville for me to read. Now this was like, at this point, this is like 2018, 19, and so maybe 2019. So the book was like 5 years old. And it was in the library of this large university in Alabama. And when I got it, it was just like this. Smelled new, the pages cracked. It was clear that no one had ever even opened the book before. And this was the only copy in the entire southeastern United States, including all of the universities. So nobody was interested in reading this. Nobody cared. This was saying, well, let's talk about it. Nobody wanted to talk about it. Nobody wanted to read it. Nobody cared. Now, if you go and you look up his bio on Wikipedia or whatever, when I first looked up his bio, it said all kinds of really flowery, great stuff. But you know, people can go in and they can edit stuff. You know, now they can go back in and make sure that, you know, and re-edit. But basically, there's this biblical historian who has a degree from a Bible college called Bert Ehrman, and he blasts him. And they say, oh. And so when you read the bio now, it says that his ideas are very controversial and he's considered fringe. Well, of course it's controversial. Everybody in the world that believes in Christianity believes he was a real person. I mean, of course it's controversial, but basically it's written that it's controversial, therefore probably a flake, you know, one of those weird on the fringe people that they're not legitimate. We shouldn't take them seriously. And everything is written in an effort to just dismiss them. And he says things like, no legitimate historian, no accredited academic historian says these things. Well, of course not. Because if you read more on the Wikipedia page, there's even a paragraph or a section where they talk about sexual misconduct. And he apparently harassed some woman or something, supposedly. And of course, you're going to find that on his wiki page. Just anything they can to try to discredit this guy. Personal attacks. Forget logic and reason and facts. Forget that, because they don't have that. Let's make personal attacks. And this is academia. This is a person that's got a doctorate degree in academia, and this is what he's using to support his argument that nobody should read this stuff because he's not a legitimate source. So the reason why no legitimate academic historian says these things is because of course they wouldn't. Because if you do say these things, what happens to you is exactly what happened to Richard Carrier, who was on a fast track to academic success, and he's kind of been derailed since then. Now, I mean, he's still highly regarded by some people, but he's now fringy. He's fringy, so he's not really in demand now, like he was before. And so, you know, if you say these things, if you dare challenge these things, you get ruined. I mean, you're everything, but I don't really have a lot to lose. I don't make my money through academia or by having lots of doctorate degrees and things like that. So I don't care. I'm just going to say, and it's not like I've got an axe to grind, or I hate religion, or I hate Christianity, or I'm an atheist because I'm very left-wing and I hate everything about establishment. None of that. None of that. I don't have any axe to grind. I don't care. And I'm not. And at the end, I'm not even talking about. I'm not even trying to discredit what people are doing. I'm just basically doing research or trying to do research to verify or not to verify the declarations, the very clear declarations that all biblical historians say, which is that there is a mountain of evidence. There is an abundance of evidence, including within the Roman record. Okay, is that true? And so if you ask a Bible historian, the first thing that they want to talk about is they want to say, well, in some Bible, in Leviticus or whatever, and I can't think of anything right now. But anyway, in the Bible, it says this, in this chapter of the Bible, verse this, book of the Bible, chapter, verse, okay. It says this, and it says this, and it says this. And all of these sources are biblical sources. And I'm like, okay, don't you have a problem with the fact that the only evidence of Jesus' historicity is in the Bible itself? And that's all the evidence? All the evidence is in the Bible? Because the Bible is not like a historical documentation of everything that happened. It's a book of prayer. It wasn't written as like a historical document. People take it now like it is a historical document, but it wasn't written that way, and it was never intended really to be that way. It's just become that way. And it's become that way because of the argument that is being made by biblical historians that there's a mountain of evidence that Jesus existed, including in the Roman record, and so therefore, since we know Jesus was a real person, then they do what's called the LLL argument, which is called the liar, lunatic, or Lord. So since we know he's a real person, and he says he's the Son of God and he's the Savior, either he was lying, or he was crazy, or he is what he said he is. And that's called the LLL argument. And it's a really central argument to the whole legitimacy of Christianity. But that argument falls apart, actually, if you shoot a hole in the historicity of Jesus and you say, well, maybe we have reasons to doubt whether or not Jesus was ever actually a real person. And so if you make a good case for that, then the whole LLL argument falls apart. Okay, so if you always use the Bible as your reference, to me it's like using the book about Rumpelstiltskin, which was written in the 1700s, to prove that Rumpelstiltskin was a real person. Now we know that he wasn't, and nobody says that he was. But you could say that he was a real person. Well, it says he was a real person according to the book. The book's, this is a story, this is a narrative. Says he was a real person, says that this happened. Well, of course it didn't, and then nobody actually says that it does. But I mean, if you keep referring to the book about Rumpelstiltskin to prove Rumpelstiltskin, how does that prove anything? So if you keep referring to the same text, the Bible, to prove that Jesus was real, I mean, the people that wrote the Bible were very biased in their opinions. And the thing is that, so, no legitimate historian has ever said or would ever say that Jesus wasn't a real person. Well, yeah, it's because it's not something people want to hear. But, by the same token, even if you're not really a real academic, if you don't really have doctorate degrees or whatever, and you're like Gavin Menzies, okay? Gavin Menzies was a guy who wrote a book basically saying that Chang Ho discovered the United States or discovered America. And his whole basis for his argument is that he's got this map that's got these old Chinese dock stamps on it. That is like a map of the whole, the New World. And he's like, here's proof that they knew it was, they knew about it before Columbus was ever there. Well, because Chang Ho was before Columbus, in the early 1400s. Well, I mean, that's it. That's the foundation. There's nothing else but that one document, which is the basis for his entire argument and his entire book. And he made millions of dollars and became an international celebrity. Why? Because he wrote something that people want to hear. People, especially people of color, immigrants, Asians, they wanted to believe that, yeah, we're the superior race. We actually discovered the New World. The white people did nothing. People want to read this, and this was written by a white guy. People want to read this. They want to believe this. So it doesn't matter that he doesn't have academic accreditation. This guy was a merchant marine by profession. He writes something people want to believe, and therefore, boom, instant celebrity status. And so that's how you become a celebrity. That's why I don't really have a lot of followers, because I do this thing called telling the truth with facts. So I'm not just spreading around narratives that makes people feel warm and cuddly and fuzzy. I'm actually just saying the truth about things. And so here's the truth, okay? In the Bible, 27, I think in the New Testament, there's 27 books. 3 of them are called the Gospels, which are considered to be like the 3 original books that existed before the Council of Nicaea, which was in the 4th century AD. And those really the only 3 books that existed before them. Now we have found fragments of Luke or Matthew, I think some early fragments of Luke, and the earliest fragments are actually of John. No fragments, though, are prior to the first decade of the 2nd century, and I talked about that in the last episode. Everything else is written in the 4th century AD or later. And so all this stuff about, all these things about Jesus and Jesus being real and the whole narrative was all basically created in the 4th century AD. And there's actually no evidence that it was ever, that it existed until that time. They invented it in the 4th century AD. Now, when we talk about Roman records, actually, there is a curious lack of evidence, because there were things called chroniclers, even at the time of Jesus, that were well known and that chronicled recent or current events. And none of these people even mention Jesus for any reason. And we're back. Okay, so there were some Roman historians that do make mention of Jesus. And these are the 2 that are referred to all the time. Every time some Bible historian talks about the Roman record, they always go to these same two guys and never anybody else. And they say, well, Josephus and Tacitus write in their journal and documents or whatever that Jesus was real. All right, so there's 2 guys, but let's talk about these 2 guys, and that's it, just those 2 guys. There is not any. He wasn't married. He didn't have any kind of an estate. He doesn't have a tomb or a family tomb or family crypt. There's no bones. He had no money. He didn't inherit any land. He didn't give away any land. He didn't own anything. He, like I said, he wasn't married. And so to say all these things like, well, it's because he was a carpenter and he did this and that and he wasn't rich and he didn't care about these things, that's fine. But then to say that there is an overwhelming mountain of evidence, that doesn't wash. So there's actually 2 what are called chroniclers, Roman chroniclers, that do mention them. The first one is Josephus. And Josephus wrote what he wrote probably in around 93 or 94 AD. And actually, the authenticity of it is debated because there's not any actual... So like the oldest actual texts of Josephus is like from like the 8th century AD. There's nothing older than that that actually still exists. But, we think it was translated from something, that existed before. So he lived in the late 1st century, and they think he wrote this around 93 or 94. But they think that what he wrote was a little bit embellished. They think actually he just made a passing comment about it. But then if you read what he wrote, it's actually a little bit more than that, and that's highly debated as to the authenticity of that, because they think that may have been a 9th century or 8th century AD or whatever embellishment where they wrote a little bit more just to make it seem like there was some kind of Roman record. But even that, we're talking 93, 94 AD, not 27 AD, is 60 years after the fact. The other guy is Tacitus, and I talked about how basically Christianity became a fad in the first decade of the 2nd century AD. And Tacitus wrote what he did in around 116 AD. And that was even less. That really was just kind of a passing mention. And so there's no contemporary chroniclers at all that make any mention of it at all. And you would think that if somebody died and they came back from the dead and people are watching them, looking at them walking around, that that might make some kind of news. Somebody might make a mention of that. Gee, there was this guy that came back to life after he was killed. Something like that, And now you might wonder, okay, well, how come there's no miracles like this that have happened since? And that's a very good question. And a lot of that has to do with the writers of the time that they're writing this and what they believed in those days. And even back to like the 16th century, so late 16th century, like Shakespeare. And if you read some Shakespeare, he talks about witches. And he talks about it like it's just a normal everyday, yeah, we all know about witches. I mean, because people in that time, even someone who is pretty well educated like Shakespeare, someone who's very intelligent, really believed in witches. People really, really, really believed that witches were real. Well, now we know that that's ridiculous. So to say that somebody came back from the dead or miracles happened, and things like that, he walked on water, we don't know how, it was magic. People really believed that in those days. Today we know that, well, that's not really physically possible. Also, there's other narratives that become true because people want it to be true. So there's two good examples. One is Marco Polo, and the other one is King Arthur. So Marco Polo basically is taught in schools and has been taught in schools that he's a real person. And in Asia, they like to believe that he was a real person. But they've actually done research on it lately, and there was a lot of Marco Polos who lived in Italy at the time that he supposedly lived, but none of these people had any type of a job that would have meant that they spent years traveling in Asia and came back. There were a few that were merchants that would have had maybe some access to some stories that were being told by merchants because it was in Venice, supposedly is where he lived. And so there was a lot of merchants coming in and out of Venice with lots of tales of their adventures and trading. But anyway, but this is regarded as factual history now. But now they're looking back at it and saying, well, maybe it was just a narrative. Maybe he was just a fictitious character, at the time. I mean, it was written in the 1400s, And around the same time also was King Arthur. And they have since done more research on that. And for many years, and all the way up until the late 20th century, they were teaching in school that King Arthur was a real person. But now we know. So Marco Polo we're not 100% sure about, but for sure King Arthur was not a real person. He was actually an amalgamation of several different characters, and he turned into one character, which was a narrative, and they've been able to, now bring it back to like the 5th century AD is when he supposedly was around, and he wasn't like the King of England, but he was like one of the kings, or he was based on one of the kings. He wasn't a real person, and it wasn't a real story, basically, is what we found out. But people believed it, really, really believed it. I mean, even in academia, even highly accredited academics wrote about King Arthur like he was a real historical person. And this is how things like this happen. So let's look at some of the arguments against the historicity. Okay, one is when we talk about Paul's epistles. So in the book of Paul, and he's actually who sort of invented Christianity. There's no biographical information about Jesus, really. He doesn't really talk about Jesus being a historical person. He mostly talks about him being like a spiritual person. But the even bigger thing is Paul's letters. So Paul's letters, which were written, I guess, to Jesus' brother, John, were supposed to have happened in the middle of the 1st century, or like in the early, maybe the 40s AD. Most likely his letters are completely fabricated, that they aren't even real. There's no evidence to prove that his letters were actually written by Paul or John or anybody that these letters were actually real. Again, this was a narrative that was written after the 4th century AD. And, it's 300 years after the fact or more. You can say whatever you want to say at that point. All right, so then there's a couple of other points here. So, and these are, if you look up Jesus mythology, I think is what it's called. These are the points, the major points that people say he's actually a mythical character. This is what they say. So the second thing is that the Gospels are not historical records, which we talked about. That number 3, there's no independent eyewitness account. So Josephus and Tacitus never met Jesus. Jesus was dead, supposedly, long before these guys ever wrote anything, and in fact, decades before they were even born. So they never met anybody that ever met them. They never interviewed anybody that ever met them. They never knew anybody that ever met them. There is no actual person that supposedly knew Jesus or met Jesus who actually wrote anything themselves, or who actually is proven to even that they were even real. So there's no independent eyewitness account. All of the witnesses and everything about Jesus is all written in the Bible. Okay, there's a lack of mention by secular scholars. Okay, so there's no mention at all. There's not a lack of mention. Like I said, there's Josephus and there's Tacitus, and those are Romans, but they did not write at the time that Jesus was supposed to be alive. And there's only, in fact, 2 non-Christian sources or mentions or references that Jesus ever existed, Josephus and Tacitus. That's it. That's all that there is. So, that's just the way it is. But for people to say, Bible historians, to go all around the country and to give these big presentations and to say that there is an overwhelming amount of evidence, there is a mountain of evidence to prove that indisputable that Jesus was a real person, I'm sorry, but this was a bold-faced lie. It is not true. There is not a mountain of evidence. There is not an overwhelming amount of evidence. In fact, there's hardly any evidence at all. In fact, there's a suspicious lack of evidence. And all of the proof, or all of the relics or whatever, or the Shroud of Turin or whatever, all these things, everything, and just a desperate attempt to prove that he was real, all of these things have been proven to be completely fake and not real. And so, you can make your own assumptions. Now, the thing is I'm not trying to say that, like I said, that I'm not trying to take Christianity away from people. I'm just talking about the facts. And the facts are that when they say that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence, and there's a mountain of evidence to prove that he was a real person, that's a lie. And if that's what they want to base the LLL argument on, well, then the LLL argument is based on a very, very flimsy premise. And if you want to base it on that, that's fine. Say that it's based on that. But stop saying that there's an overwhelming mountain of evidence, because there just isn't. There just isn't. And if you try to say anything against it, you have a character assassination big time, like what happened with Richard Carrier if you read his bio. Okay, so I'm not actually saying that Jesus wasn't real. If you want to believe that he was real, that's fine. If you feel that he was real in your heart and you believe, that's fine. That's where it should come from. It should come from your heart. If you feel that you have a spiritual connection, that's fine. I'm not saying that that's not legitimate. When somebody dies and somebody swears that they appeared at the foot of their bed and they said, it's okay, I'm in a better place now, and things like that, I'm not saying that that's not real. There's a lot of evidence of people that really have had these profound experiences. And there is something, I think, to spirituality. I'm not trying to discredit that, but it should come from here. If the reason why you believe is because they say, he was a real person, therefore the LLL argument, so there's no point in denying Jesus. Well, understand that that's a very weak argument, and that actually he probably, maybe he might not have been a real person. And the Bible historians and that whole community really needs to address that and come to terms with that and own that, because that's the facts. So I wanted to look into, is there really a mountain of evidence about Jesus existing? And the reality is, no, there isn't. And so that's all I'm really trying to do. I'm not against spirituality. I'm not even against religion. The communities that religion that are based around religion are very, very helpful and profound. It's a wonderful thing. And actually the Bible is an amazing document. I mean, there's all kinds of stories of morality within the Bible, really cleverly written things. I mean, I'm not saying that, it's a horrible thing. Now, there's also things in the Bible that says like, okay, these are the kind of slaves that we're allowed to own. And this is how many slaves we're allowed to own. And there's not just one mention, there's lots of mentions about slavery and what's okay and what's not okay. Well, today we know that that's all wrong. So, if you discredit those parts of the Bible, I mean, you kind of have to discredit, what don't you discredit? I mean, and people are saying, well, okay, so God isn't this or God isn't that or da-da-da. That's fine too. People are like, so I'm saying that maybe he needs to be redefined. Maybe God or Jesus or whatever, the whole phenomenon, maybe it just needs to be redefined. And instead of making all of these false narratives and false claims, let's stick to the facts, let's embrace the truth, and go from there. That's a way forward that I can wrap my brain around. Okay? So as I was saying before, is that, okay, so the earliest evidence of Josephus is the earliest documents were written in Greek, so they weren't written by him. He didn't write in Greek. And they're from the 11th century AD, which is why they're questionable, because they could have been, altered from the original text. The Old Testament is 75% of the Bible, and the Gospels are only 11% of the New Testament. So it's 11% of 25%. So most of the Bible is a very big, thick, impressive book. Does not talk about Jesus, okay? And also, the other thing about the Bible that's interesting is that it was not written as prose. It wasn't written as like a story, like King Arthur's story or Marco Polo. It was written, basically, it was written in literally a series of tweets. It's a book, chapter, and verse. And each of these verses is basically a tweet. Each one of these verses is a small little, it's like maybe 10 words long. It's a tweet. It was written in a series of tweets because even 2,000 years ago, or 1,600 years ago, they knew that most people, like 98% of the population, can only think in tweets. They can only wrap their brains around a tweet and nothing more. And so they broke the Bible down into a series of tweets so that you can go in and you can quote one of these tweets rather than quoting, pages and pages of something, which is what I do. And so even that was intentionally written to appeal to, the masses. It was not written to appeal to academia. It was not written as an academic record. It was written as a text to appeal to the masses and the uneducated. Okay, so the other thing about religion that I want to say is that, or religion in general, is that Gandhi said that all religion is true. And I believe that is true to a degree, that there are elements of truth to be found, and that there is something that spirituality is a real thing. If you feel it, it's real. If you believe it, I'm not trying to knock that. But that's where it should come from. It should come from your heart, not as an academic, analytical argument saying that this was a real person, therefore you have to believe because it's stupid not to believe because he was a real person. No, that's a lie. Or we don't know, actually. But we know that there's not a lot of evidence. It should come from your heart. That's where it needs to come from. That's where religion and your spirituality and how you feel should come from. It should come from your heart and nothing else. and anything else, for them to say that he was proved to be true, that's a lie. Whether you want to believe it or not. Okay, so I think that about covers the episode. I'm sure I've blown everybody's mind. I'm just talking about attacking false narratives and calling the truth for what it is and saying, look, this is the truth. What you want to think or what you want to believe, that's up to you. I don't care. But this is the facts. These are the actual real facts. If you want to read more, I recommend reading his book. Nobody does, but I recommend that you should if you have an interest in it. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'm Scott Powers Houston. This was Learning with Power. This was episode 29. Thank you very much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all those good things. And we'll see you next time when we do another lesson on history. And we're going to basically be talking about the world in 3500 BC, which is really when history begins. And that's going to be what we're going to talk about in the next episode. So stay tuned for that. We'll see you then. Until then, you have a great day. Take care. Bye.